today I wanted to share with you some of the research I've been doing for my PhD, which looks at the politics of enclosure during the reign of George III and asks whether it was for public benefit or private gain. And the reign of George III, which was from 1760 to 1820, was significant because this is when Parliament, rather than the monarch, became responsible for administering the Crown lands. Now, changes to the British Constitution on his accession enabled the royal forests and the New Forest among them to be increasingly regarded as a political and economic resource of the government rather than as a source of income for the monarch. The detachment of the king from the royal forests meant that the old system, which upheld the preservation and protection of the venison and the vert, could be remade anew by a system of government that weighed, measured, calculated and surveyed each and every state asset to assess its economic viability. Henceforth, attempts to privatise the New Forest were not only made possible, but perhaps inevitable, a development that would have serious implications to the future of the forest's commoning community and the very survival of its ancient landscape. So in this paper, I want to show you how from the late 18th century, attempts were made using the narrative of public good and national benefit to enclose parts of the New Forest for timber production and dispose of the remainder by public sale. While these attempts were ostensibly to relieve the great timber crisis that was believed to be afflicting Britain in general and the Royal Navy in particular, there were suspicions from people in the 18th century that the proposals were based upon what 21st century observers would call fake news. Indeed, one particular 18th century politician who advocated limiting commoners' rights and commercialising and privatising the New Forest stood to gain personally from its sale into private hands. And of course, while the same thing could not possibly happen today, public interest would become manipulated by private ambition. So, okay. At the beginning of George III's reign in 1760, the English countryside would have been recognisable to many of us in this room as looking much like the landscape of the New Forest today. Indeed, the form of free-range farming on unenclosed lands that had developed since before the Middle Ages would have been well known to those living in England up until the late 18th century, where millions of acres between the Yorkshire and Dorset coasts provided a country scene that was still largely medieval in appearance. But by the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century, the rural picture had changed considerably, and the majority of the countryside had become enclosed into the rectangular field systems with their perimeter markers such as hedges, ditches and fences that are now regarded as quintessential rural England. Enclosures were not just a physical transformation of the landscape, but a fundamental alteration in the psychological understanding of land occupancy. Along with crop rotation and selective breeding, these hallmarks of the agricultural revolution replaced established agrarian practices such as commoning and the customs that had for time out of mind preserved an ancient way of life. Now, commoning was representative of a system of land tenure that, while being restricted in its principle, because not everyone had common rights after all, was nevertheless collective in its operation. Commoning was founded on the principle of meeting needs by communities sharing natural resources for a sustainable subsistence existence. Enclosures, on the other hand, signalled a change in social and cultural norms, which saw a rise in private property and individualism. Indeed, the developing political ideology of economic growth, consumer spending, and agricultural surpluses as a principle of modern government began to take shape during the 18th century. Some historians suggest that the process of agricultural revolution was a protracted development. W.G. Hoskins suggests, for example, that the enclosure of open fields into smaller fields and the reclamation of the wild lands had been going on intermittently and with a varying pace in every century. And indeed, Mark Overton maintains that phases of revolution have been identified for at least 5 periods between 1560 and 1880, and each has been characterised by a different combination of significant agricultural developments. However, Chambers and Mingay calculate that between 1760 and 1799, enclosures brought at least 2 million acres and perhaps over 3 million acres of wild, uncultivated land into production. Thus, the reign of George III represents a peak in the rate of enclosures and the subsequent changes in the use and familiarity with the open landscape. So, for the New Forest, the threat of enclosure became a reality with the constitutional changes that occurred when George III ascended the throne. And incidentally, before he was known as the Mad King, he was known as Farmer George. And when he was crowned in 1760, George III surrendered to Parliament the greater part of the hereditary revenues of the Crown, including the Crown lands, many of the minor prerogatives, and the hereditary excise. And this he did in return for a fixed civil list payment. Now, this was done ultimately to protect each member of Parliament's own interests and the constitutional notion of private property, signalling a significant shift in the balance of political power. By removing the Crown lands from his control, Parliament made it impossible for George III and future monarchs to raise finance for themselves without the approval of Parliament, and thereby removing any likelihood of the monarch's personal rule. Now, Parliament at this stage was dominated by factions and allegiances of aristocratic and landed gentry families, rather than by a coherent party political structure. And theirs was a long-term view that saw political influence not just in spans of 1 or 2 terms of office, but in generations. And rather than imposing a sovereign will or a set of political policies, they responded to the demands of like-minded landed interests and provided a legal service to individuals and groups with objectives similar to theirs. And this is evidenced by the enormous number of Acts of Parliament to enclose common land, which were submitted in a cut and paste pro forma style, transforming the English landscape at a revolutionary pace. So from 1760, rather than being subject to royal prerogative and authority of the monarch, the New Forest became notionally an asset of the people, a state resource that would in future be directed by government and the statutory powers of Parliament. During this time, the government began to develop erudite methods to scrutinise the topographical resources of the state and to calculate their worth. State-appointed commissioners tasked with surveying the Crown lands, consulted surveys, interviewed witnesses, appointed map makers, and commandeered information in order to provide expert analysis on the potential worth of an improved forest. And the 5th report of the commissioners appointed to inquire into the state and condition of woods, forest and land revenues of the Crown, which was dated July 1789, and dealt specifically with the New Forest, is a very good example of this. And its recommendations, particularly as regards to commoning, were to have implications for the New Forest for the next century and beyond. In previous centuries, the commoning way of life had not only existed alongside, but had been inexorably linked to the royal forest system. And this system was fundamentally organised around the protection and preservation of deer and its habitat. However, the symbolic power and iconic majesty of the deer had begun to diminish. Deer were, after all, regarded as a pest by the tree growers. And the deer were replaced by the emblematic representations of the mighty oak, particularly when Britannia began to rule the waves. Oak became so symbolic to the British nation that the Navy's anthem, written in 1759 by David Garrick, was entitled Heart of Oak, in which its rousing sentiments connected the native tree to national pride and naval tradition. According to a shipbuilder writing in 1763 who claimed to be well acquainted with the New Forest, there the timber would plant itself if it were fenced in to keep out the young cattle of all kinds from destroying the young trees as they come up. The common rights in the New Forest were proving an obstacle to the development of timber plantations, and the unpatriotic cows of the commoners, like the deer, would have to be dealt with. This was because during the reign of George III, there was a widely held belief in a scarcity of timber, and more particularly of that sort of which our ships are constructed. Ever since Britain had begun developing global interests, the supply and demand of timber for naval shipbuilding had been a cause for anxiety. John Mortimer, writing in 1716 about managing and improving land, declared, "When we consider that trade, riches, and strength are inseparable, and that our great dependence is upon our navy, we might have hoped so great a concern to the nation should have occasioned a greater care in the propagating and preserving of timber, that is of principal use to support it." Mortimer's comments reveal what was at the heart of the matter. The global dominance of Britain was indivisible from the might of her navy, and there was a genuine belief that a lack of commitment to the planting and protection of oak trees would be detrimental to the economic interests of the nation. In fact, the political importance of timber in the 18th century has been likened to the situation with oil today. Thus, during the reign of George III, attempts would be made to pass laws to enclose large sections of the New Forest for the purpose of increasing and preserving timber. All activities which were considered to have a detrimental impact upon the production of timber, such as the commoners' fuel, pasture and pannage rights and the browsing of deer, were to be reduced, controlled or eliminated. Thus, for the New Forest, the belief in a scarcity of naval timber was to have profound implications, as it would be on this conviction that proposals for changing its fundamental purpose and practices would be based. The fear of a timber scarcity had been experienced on and off since Tudor times, but the reign of George III was different because, apart from the fact that Britain was at war for almost the majority of his reign, it was the politicians who were directly responsible for the administration of the Crown lands and for finding solutions to the timber problem. Their actions would see the status of the New Forest forever altered, from a royal deer forest into a commercial tree plantation, as ministers attempted to turn an ancient ecological system into a modern economical one. For the New Forest, the scarcity of timber had several dimensions. First, the narrative of scarcity was predicated on the belief that large swathes of the New Forest landscape had been deforested and needed to be re-established. Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth Army bore the brunt of this assertion. However, in the case of the New Forest, the reason for the lack of trees was not because they'd been destroyed by the Roundhead troops, but because they'd never actually been there in the first place. The New Forest had never supported a closed canopy forest over which a mythical squirrel could pass without its paws ever touching the ground. Second, the narrative of scarcity was nationalistic in its discourse because it asserted that only English oak was good enough for naval shipbuilding, and consequently tree planting was promoted as a patriotic enterprise while foreign imports were shunned. This meant that places like the New Forest had to be used for plantations. Third, the narrative asserted that the ancient rights of common, as practiced within the New Forest, were contrary to public good. Philip Le Broc, writing in 1794, declared that the adoption of plans for the gradual and extensive increase of oak and other timber in the New Forest was of great national importance, and that the fair claims of individuals, which are at present an obstacle to the adoption of such a plan, ought to be fully allowed and liberally removed and annihilated. The needs of the many were considered to outweigh the needs of the few, no matter how ancient or established in law they were, and disafforestation or suspension of common rights to permit enclosure was deemed to be the only practical solution. There was, of course, another dimension, that of good old-fashioned greed, where some local landowners saw an opportunity to increase their estates. The best example of this is the New Forest Timber Bill, which was presented to the House of Commons in 1792. While ostensibly being promoted for the increase and preservation of timber that could be used for the Navy, it finally failed in the House of Lords because of suspicions regarding the motives of the bill's most assiduous defender, this man. The man who probably drew up the bill, the Right Honourable George Rose, Esquire. When the bill was presented to Parliament, he held the positions of the Keeper of Records in the Chapter House, Westminster, Surveyor of Green Wax Moneys, Secretary to the Treasury, Master of the Exchequer Pleas Office, MP for Christchurch, Agent for Dominica, and Verderer of the New Forest. He seems to have been a very busy man, and a very rich busy man, who was not above being accused in the popular press of insatiable greed and corruption. So George Rose had been born the son of a penniless Scottish vicar, served in the Navy as a midshipman on a bomb ketch, but was able to rise up to be included within the highest ranks of the British establishment, where he was a firm fixture within Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger's inner circle. Not only had George Rose gained respectability, influence and wealth, but he'd also married an heiress and bought a large country estate. The estate he bought was here. Surely not a coincidence, Cuffnells, in the middle of the New Forest, which he'd purchased in 1784. So when the New Forest Timber Bill passed through the House of Commons and into the Lords, even though it claimed the further increase and preservation of timber for the Royal Navy, suspicions were raised that it had been written purely to increase Rose's political influence in the county and to increase his land holdings by enabling him to purchase neighbouring parts of the forest. And in fact, if these suspicions had not existed at this time, we would well be attending a different type of conference today, or indeed be looking at another outcome for the practice of commoning and the future of the New Forest. But nevertheless, as the New Forest Timber Bill came into the House of Lords, political tensions that had long been brewing erupted. And previous clashes in Parliament between Prime Minister William Pitt, seen here as Death, and Lord Chancellor Edward Thurlow, here as is the Devil. So the fight came to a head. And this is a satire on Milton's Paradise Lost, in which Pitt, the character of Death, shelters himself under the king's crown and defends himself with the sceptre. The Queen, pictured as Sin, with serpent's legs and the key to hell around her waist, is protecting Pitt. And indeed, the Queen had intervened with the king in favour of Pitt. So Thurlow, in the character of Satan, is seen here. He's attacking with the Lord Chancellor's mace, which is beginning to fracture in the struggle. And George Rose is one of the hellhounds here between Pitt's legs. Now, as a result of these political clashes, the king reluctantly asked his good friend, Lord Thurlow, to resign the Great Seal. But as it was so close to the end of the parliamentary session, he was allowed to carry on chancery business until the prorogation only a few weeks later, where it was reported that, embittered and spiteful at the triumph of the boy, meaning Pitt, Thurlow set his tusks into the New Forest Enclosure Bill and gored it unmercifully. And the bill was one of the final pieces of government business waiting to be passed that session, and one that Pitt was accused of promoting for the benefit of his friend George Rose. And it was Thurlow's last chance to extract revenge. So accordingly, the New Forest Timber Bill, which had always been looked upon as the favourite child of Mr. Secretary Rose, was regarded as having lurking designs and unconstitutional tendencies, and together with pressures of petitions from the New Forest landowners, it was quietly shelved. So in conclusion, the fear of a timber shortage for the Royal Navy, though keenly felt, was never realised. And after Nelson's decisive victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, the climate of fear began to subside. And the anxiety regarding naval timber disappeared altogether after 1860 with the development of ironclad warships. Britain's vast developing empire had ensured that timber supplies, though regarded as being inferior quality to native grown stocks, could always be acquired if needed. And even though George Rose failed to enclose and sell off the New Forest in 1792, he was able to resurrect the principles of the New Forest Timber Bill and introduce legislation by the end of George III's reign that would see an increase in timber production and the use of enclosures, a reduction in the ancient commonable rights of the forest's inhabitants, and the rise and dominance of the Surveyor General's Office and then Office of Woods, the forerunner to the Forestry Commission. By the way, his estate at Cuffnells near Lyndhurst also increased in size. So historically, while factional infighting among politicians has defeated some proposals, an ever-vigilant commoning community and their supporters and the general public have been left to resist other attempts to privatise what for the present remains a national asset. Thank you.